Well, let's get started. We'll get Ryan started here. I've got 6 o'clock. I think that's right. And
Mhm.
uh, Brian is a longtime friend. I've known him since I guess it's about 20. John and I were just talking about this. Known him for about 20 some years. And I think, Brian, the first place I met you was at solar education we were doing out at the Dodge Nature Center.
It could have
And
been.
yeah, way back when. And then Brian has also done a wonderful job of, helping MRES along the way with various projects and stuff. And when Laura was working with us, he was wonderful to help us out with all kinds of things there and help us keep projects on the board. So uh, he's vice president at Great Plains Institute, and I've asked him to share some information about that organization. And some people don't know about it, so it'll be good to hear about that. And he's in charge of the renewable energy team at Great Plains Institute. And I'm really excited to hear his talk tonight because I think it's a topic that's a little different than we hear about normally. So, Brian, with that, thank you for doing this, and go ahead and jump in.
Okay, well, uh, great to be here and great to help MRES. And hopefully, the people who are on the call won't have already heard everything I have to say. Um, I'm gonna, I decided to focus on kind of one topic that we spend a lot of time with at Great Plains Institute on our team. Um, we work across the spectrum of solar energy. Actually, a lot more than that, but and we do work at the rooftop kind of level all the way up to the solar farm. But recently, a lot of the work that we've been doing is kind of working to try to uh, um, remove barriers to large-scale solar and make sure that communities are benefiting from it. We call this the co-benefit approach to solar development, and it focuses on community scale and large-scale solar, um, which I'll explain more in a little bit. Um, the Great Plains Institute is a nonprofit organization. It's been around for almost 30 years now. Um, our mission, shown right here on the screen, is we're accelerating the transition to net zero carbon emissions for the benefit of people, the economy, and the environment. And we do try to take that kind of multi-beneficial approach to the work we do. As Doug said, I'm the head of the renewable energy team at GPI. GPI is based out of Minneapolis. We have about 80 employees, and most of whom are based in Minnesota. Um, we do have a heavy presence in Minnesota and in the Midwest, but we do work nationally on a number of issues as well, uh, so that we have a presence across the nation. Um, we have 5 different program areas that we work in order to achieve the transition to net zero carbon emissions. We pretty much cover all of the emission sectors and all of the energy technologies in one way or another. So we have the other 4 teams that we have are the energy systems team, which focuses at the kind of in the regulatory realm of utilities and at the kind of state government level in terms of carbon planning and climate planning. And doing transmission work out of that program. We have a program, Transportation and Fuels, which does a lot of the kind of helps with things like we were just talking about beforehand, with things like ride-in drives. Uh, that program staffs the Drive Electric Minnesota and the Biofuel Economy Coalition of Minnesota. Does Midwestern work on EV corridors and works across states on low carbon fuel standards. Um, as well as doing some work on more explicitly on working lands in terms of kind of agriculture and forestry. Um, to kind of bring those sectors down in terms of carbon emissions. We then have a communities team, which is a lot of people here might be familiar with, which is somewhat unusual compared to a lot of energy nonprofit organizations, in that we really focus on how community organizations, well, communities, and in particular local governments, can actually be a vector for change. A lot of organizations kind of view communities as an obstacle, or local governments as an obstacle, and we actually see it as an agent for change. And so we're trying to help make communities the point of the spear on some of our climate work, because it is important to remember that, and a lot of people actually don't know this, but the most aggressive climate goals in the nation that are set by government are set by local governments. They're more aggressive and more far-reaching than state government or anything at the federal government in terms of their ambition. The one thing, however, communities do need, they can't operate independently and have to work in partnership. And so we really work on that in the communities team to move ahead. And um, I'm currently the lead of the renewable energy team, and I'm the interim lead of the yeah, of the renewable team. I'm the lead, and I'm the interim lead of the communities team, as Lola Schoenrich, our leader in that space for the last 17 years, is stepping back a little bit. Um, and our final team is the carbon management team, and they work with industrial sector, and look at both kind of reducing industrial emissions and some of the real difficulties that there are in that, as well as on some carbon negative solutions, which include some carbon capture, but other kinds of technologies that are sequestration based in terms of kind of removing carbon from the atmosphere. So those are our five teams and are all of our technologies that we work on. And then I'm going to talk, of course, mainly about the renewable team and the work that we do there. So I'm going to spend just a little bit of time setting the stage for kind of the work that we do and why we're doing the work in the renewable team that we have been working on. Um, the A lot of the work, and this is kind of the work that MRES has been involved with for a very long time. Yeah, a lot of the work in the renewable space over the years has focused on how do we make renewables a cost-effective and uh, cost-effective and competitive component of our nation's energy portfolio. And so there was a lot of work for years and years on things like um, renewable energy portfolio standards and requirements for renewable energy and utility planning, and various tax incentives, creating tax incentives in order to kind of bring the cost of renewables down so it would be competitive. But about for wind energy, probably about 10 or 15 years ago, it actually got to the point where it was cost effective, that it was actually competitive with conventional generation. And then about 7 or 8 years ago, um, solar energy also reached that point where the kind of cost effectiveness of those two forms of renewable generation became the cheapest way to generate a kilowatt hour of electricity in the world. Uh, and at that point, you might think, well, okay, our mission accomplished, right? We now have the economic winds at our back, and we just have to let the market work. But of course, the market sometimes doesn't work. And what we have realized is that even though it's the cheapest way to generate electricity with wind and solar, there are all kinds of other barriers that prevent rapid adoption and accelerated deployment of solar and wind energy. And I'm going to focus mostly on solar energy tonight. But it was because of that that we actually decided to form the Renewable Energy Program at GPI, because we tend not to be policy advocates. We're not out like a lot of NGOs are, of kind of identifying things that policies that need to be changed and then advocating for them at the legislature, at the state level, or at the federal level. We actually do very little advocating unless we're doing it on behalf of other coalitions. So what we do really is try to bring people together to resolve barriers to the way of deployment of clean energy technologies and provide technical assistance where that makes some sense, or even do research where that makes sense in order to fill scientific gaps, create best practices, and help those market barriers move out of the way so we can actually have deployment of solar energy um, in a way that is going to be sustainable over time. And I just wanted to put this graph up. This is those of you who are data geeks will appreciate this. Maybe you've seen this graph. Lawrence Berkeley Lab keeps this. This is a graph that shows Lawrence Berkeley Lab every year they do an assessment of all of the large scale electric generation that is requesting interconnection to the transmission queue, a transmission grid, what we call the queue. Um, and so, because everybody who wants to build a power plant has to ask the transmission entities for interconnection, because it's a complicated process to interconnect a power plant. And this is showing at a point in time at the end of the year, Lawrence Berkeley Lab would assess the entire nation and see what were the kinds of power plant generation that were actually projects that were asking for interconnection to the grid. And it goes all the way back to 2007 on the left-hand side of this. And then it goes up to 2023 on the right-hand side. And you can see the transition that we have seen over the last 15 years of the kinds of energy that are coming onto the grid and where the market is going. And there's two remarkable things about this graph that are very important. One is, of course, that the kind of generation that is asking for interconnection, or the kind of projects that are being developed have transformed over time to now on the right-hand side, we're seeing it's primarily over half of it is solar energy or energy storage. Energy storage didn't even show up on the graph. It wasn't even enough to kind of make an appearance until about 2018. Solar energy, of course, if you go back to 2007, is just a tiny fraction of the total amount. And wind energy was a little bit more and has actually, interestingly, declined in time in terms of the new interconnection coming onto the grid or asking for interconnection on the grid. So there's a number of trends here that are very interesting, but the most significant one, of course, is the transformation of solar energy from an afterthought to the primary form of electric generation that's currently coming onto the grid. And then the other thing about this graph that's important to point out that you probably already noticed is that the amount of generation as measured by capacity from 2007 to 2023 has changed. It has gone up by like 400 or 500%. And there is now in 2023 the total amount of capacity of projects asking for interconnection to the grid is at 2,600 gigawatts. Just to put that in perspective, if you took all of the existing electric generation on the grid today, right now, every kind of generation, solar, wind, natural gas, coal, everything, and added it all up, there would only be about 1,300 gigawatts. So basically, there's double the amount of new capacity asking for interconnection on the grid as there is capacity in the United States. So this is a demonstration of the market for renewable energy, that there's this many projects that think they can find economic viability. Now, a lot of these projects won't ever get built that are in the queue, but they're all viable projects. You can't enter the queue unless you have site control and a whole series of conditions. So they're all real projects. So I just want to kind of show what the market is like nationally that is kind of driving what a lot of the work we're doing. This is the a graphic that takes that same kind of queue data and looks at just the kind of 5 or 6 Midwestern states, kind of the upper Midwestern states. And this is showing only the proposed solar development. And you can see that Minnesota is kind of in the middle of the pack with about 9 gigawatts of proposed solar. I should say that by comparison, the total amount of solar that's ever been built in Minnesota in all of history is about 1.9 gigawatts. So this is up to 9 gigawatts of projects that are requesting interconnection. But if you look at the state of Illinois, in that state, there's 50 gigawatts of solar that are requesting interconnection to the queue. And in the state of Indiana, some right behind that at about 49. So we have a whole lot of solar in the Midwest that's requesting interconnection. And for this reason is kind of getting to the point where we've decided at GPI that we need to enable this huge market demand to actually come to realization by removing barriers. And one of the main barriers to that deployment is the concerns that local communities and some of the associated stakeholder groups have about how solar fits into their community. We're asking the communities around the nation to become hosts for the clean energy system. And this is actually creating a barrier that we're trying to resolve. And we call that building social license. We want renewable energy, we want solar energy to have social license, which is basically acceptance of this form of land use in the communities where it's actually being built. So this is kind of the formal definition of social license, which is the level of acceptance or approval by local communities and stakeholders of organizations in their operations. So there's increasingly social license is a critical component particularly when you're in a democratic jurisdiction where you need to bring people along in order to approve your projects. If we're not working in partnership with the communities where these things are going, we're going to be facing headwinds and opposition, and we won't be achieving our renewable energy goals. So there was a recent survey, Lawrence Berkeley Lab. I showed you their Q data. Here is a survey that they did of developers that said, why are projects failing? Why do they get canceled? All those projects in the queue that don't get built, why do they not get built? And this was a fascinating study. Now, I will emphasize this is just a survey of the developers. It wasn't validated in any way. So this is basically what large-scale developers perceive as the barriers to solar and wind energy, and it shows both solar and wind here. And the top three things are local ordinances and zoning, grid interconnection, and community opposition. And obviously, the local ordinance zoning and the community opposition are kind of work hand in hand. And there are a few other things in there, but those are the three big ones. And we have to kind of figure out how we can resolve these different things in order to really see the deployment go up and to have these projects that are in the queue actually get built. Here's some reasons why, again, from the developer perspective, why we saw opposition at the local level. So what are the most important concerns for solar and wind in terms of opposition? And the most important one was visual impact. Is it people feel that these developments are changing the character of their community? And visual impact is, of course, a very soft kind of perceptual thing, but it's something that is still real, and it results in real opposition. And it's something that those of us who do land use planning have been dealing with forever, kind of the visual impacts and the community character impacts of different kinds of development. And this is something that is of major importance for both solar and wind, a little bit more so for wind. But the top three things, or I should say the top four things for solar energy that come into play in terms of opposition are visual impacts, um, um, loss of agricultural land for large scale solar, impacts on residential property values, and impacts on community character. So, and you can see several of those things are very related. And the loss of agricultural land in particular, if we're talking about doing large scale solar in rural communities, when they perceive ag land is going under to development, that's a change in their community character. So these things are all interrelated. Now we move past the uh, developer survey, and we did some work working with our Minnesota Department of Commerce. Um, they looked at 9 solar projects in Minnesota, and all of the written comments about that in terms of kind of what people were commenting on when projects were up for review by the Department of Commerce, and because the Department of Commerce is permitting almost all the large scale solar in the state. Um, and you can see that there's the 9 projects and the number of projects. This analysis looked at about 262 different comments and put them in categories of different kinds of opposition or different kinds of concern. And you can see that, interestingly, about 23% of the comments that were received were actually in favor of the projects. They were actually expressing project support. But that means the rest of those projects were expressing some kind of concern, not necessarily opposition, but concern about different things. And the things that stood out, across all of these projects in Minnesota were the impact on the environment or natural resources, the concerns about the way vegetation was going to be managed on the site, and wildlife protection were the kind of big ones that showed up here. And then there's a host of other ones. We looked at the site that had um, the most comments on it, which is the Byron site solar project. There were about 87 comments, and you can see here that, oh, and my graph got messed up, unfortunately. Wonder how that happened. But the things that showed up here as most prominent included loss of farmland was one of the top ones. I think it was that green bar. And as well as some of the habitat and natural resource issues. So if we want to develop social license, we need to kind of figure out what are the objections to solar energy, and then how do we address them. And I want to do a demonstration now of what social license actually means and the impacts that it can have on the acceptance of projects at the community level. So what we have here are a number of things that people have objected to about solar energy. Large scale solar energy. That you put in a large farm and it transforms the natural landscape. It's perceived to be exposing nearby residents to health and safety risks that get discussed at public hearings. That people are concerned because large scale solar is perceived as being benefiting only, the distant urban areas and not the communities in which it actually lives. So it's kind of, why should we have to bear this for the sake of Minneapolis and Chicago when we don't get any benefit from it? There are visual impacts. It creates a visual monoculture. It's kind of like you look across this sea of solar panels. Why do I want to be looking at that when I could be looking at something else in my rural residence? There's a lot of discussion around soils. Solar energy is perceived to have an impact on soils, and then also kind of is perceived to use toxic and environmentally persistent chemicals in our rural communities. Now, the interesting thing that I want to say after going through that in great detail is if you look at these things, are we talking about renewable energy or are we talking about agriculture? Because if you go down this list of things here, every one of these things applies to agriculture. It transforms the natural landscape. It exposes residents to health and safety risks. It primarily benefits the commodity markets worldwide. It creates a visual monoculture. It diminishes, at least in conventional ag practices, diminishes our productive soils, and it uses toxic and environmentally persistent chemicals in the conventional agricultural practice. So why is it that the very things that people object to for solar, they are fine with on agriculture? And the answer is agriculture has social license, solar doesn't. And that's what we're trying to transform here. I don't say these things, these kind of criticisms, perceived criticisms of agriculture as a means of saying that agriculture is bad. All things have positives and negatives, but it's just interesting that the very things that people object to around solar are also things that are true about agriculture, but they're okay with it. So In regard to our social license, this is kind of the one thing I want you to remember is that in the clean energy future, all communities are host communities. In the conventional energy system, we had a few communities that have centralized power plants, a few communities that are coal mining or oil producing or natural gas producing communities, and then the rest of us are consumers. So we had people who hosted the energy system and people who really primarily just benefit from it. In the clean energy future, all communities are host communities. Solar energy is everywhere. There is not a single community in the United States that doesn't have an economically viable solar energy resource. And landowners are going to want to take advantage of that. And that includes rural landowners. So the second thing I want to note is that most communities have in fact identified their local development priorities. Most communities have thought through how they want their community to be, and they've identified this and actually, in many cases, adopted it like in a comprehensive plan or a master plan or some other kind of document that has been gone through a vetting process with the community in terms of kind of putting forward a plan of development. And this is something that needs to be attended to in the renewable energy development process, because solar energy can be sited and designed consistent with the community priorities and development plans if we do it the right way and if we attend to it ahead of time and help the community understand that we're actually working with their plan, not against it. And if we do that, we're going to transform from that no industrial solar sign to something here where communities perceive that this is what solar energy is, not something to put up opposition signs for. So here's low impact considerations in developing social license. How do we actually go about doing that? And this is kind of the notion of recognizing environmental justice in our energy transition communities. We talk about the energy transition frequently about the things that communities that used to have centralized coal power plants or natural gas plants are having to deal with as those plants get shut down. Places like the Sherco plant in Becker, Becker and Sherburne County, and city of Cohasset in Itasca County with the Boswell plant. Those things are getting shut down. They're losing tax base. They're losing employment. Things happening, and energy transition is usually talked about in that regard. Places that have coal mines that are now becoming unviable, et cetera. And that's kind of the backward looking energy transition and environmental justice perspective. But there's also a perspective looking forward that there are energy transitions that we're asking a lot of other communities to go through as well. Instead of removing energy generation that they've had forever, we're asking them to host energy generation. And those forward-looking communities already have established viable economies, resources, and cultures, and we need to think about that as an environmental justice issue as we move forward with our renewable energy development. What does environmental justice mean? I had to put this up here just because it's a term that people bandy about, and I wanted to kind of use the US DOE office definition. Environmental justice is the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of considerations, with respect to the development, implementation, enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. So the people who are affected by environmental laws, regulations, and policies should have a say in the formation of those policies. That's what environmental justice is. And you can see in the development process, what that means is having a meaningful say in how we are decarbonizing our energy system, but also how particular projects sit on the landscape in their community. And fair treatment means that no population is bearing a disproportionate share of negative environmental consequences from the kinds of things that we're doing in order to meet our climate goals. And meaningful involvement means that the communities and the people affected by this are able to produce environmental justice for themselves. We don't give them environmental justice, they create it for themselves. That's community participation, and that means we have to work in partnership with all these host communities. So what does this mean for solar? acknowledging local priorities in order to build the social license. When we do solar development, this really comes down to two elements. One is siting, which is about where do we put these things? Where do they go? Where are the sites that we're choosing to actually locate them? And then the second one is site design. How should you actually design and build and operate the site facilities once you select where they're going? And these are two critical issues to remember as we kind of think about this from an environmental justice standpoint and about a building partnership and removing building social license and removing barriers. I had a conversation just today with several county officials um, who noted that they had no say in where large scale solar was being installed. That they basically were kind of passive recipients when developers came in and said, "You have an interconnection opportunity in your community, and we want to put it in a solar farm." And we had a discussion about that and saying, well, would counties be interested in proactively identifying where things should be sited? Should we as a state be talking about where we should be putting these things in order to maximize the benefits to the host communities? And this is something that we haven't really done much of, but it really is important. And so the siting issue is actually a very important one. Site design, however, is also a component because once you decide to put something somewhere, you can build it well and you can build it poorly. You can operate it well or you can operate it poorly. And those are very important to the host community. So in that regard, we talk a lot about co-benefits. How do we create co-benefits in solar development? Well, what does that mean? What does that term co-benefit mean? And here's kind of an academic description of what it means as it co-benefits of greenhouse gas reduction. This is right out of the IPCC assessment all the way back in 2007. Recognizing that most of the policies that affect that reduce greenhouse gases also have other, at least equally important rationales. That's the co-benefit, that the reduction of greenhouse gases is what we do, and other good things happen because of that. And there's this kind of academic description. There's economic good things, there's environmental good things, there's social good things, political institution, and this is all well and good, and these things have all been mapped out. But the way that we think about it and the way that's easiest to think about it is co-benefit approach to solar development, that if you go into a community and you restore their watersheds function, or you diversify their agricultural systems, or you enhance the habitat in the community, or you protect their drinking water supplies, or you enhance their tax revenue, does it matter that it's a solar farm? The communities sometimes care more about the co-benefit than they do about the main benefit. They may not be climate advocates. They may not even believe in climate change, but you can still put them on your side if you do things that are important to them. That's why it's important to understand what they've already said that they think are important. If you go to almost any county comprehensive plan in the state of Minnesota, at the county level, they will say agriculture is our main portion of our economic base, and we're going to give it priority in development. We're going to protect it from being overly developed. And that was put in place long before solar showed up. But it's an important thing to think about when you're doing solar development. These counties have already identified agriculture as their priority. So how are we going to address that in the solar development we're doing? How do we make that a co-benefit? And that's kind of what we're working on here. So what do developers look for when they're doing a solar development? They want to have access to a solar resource, right? I mean, you can't do a solar farm unless you have sunshine. That usually means, a place without trees. It usually means relatively flat topography, ideally, not always, but that's the ideal. We want to do it in an undeveloped area or a place with very low density, so we're minimizing conflicts with residential. You don't want to do it immediately right to or try to do it on protected lands. Our scientific and natural areas are protected for a reason. We don't want to do solar development on top of it. You usually want to look in places that have larger parcels, fewer landowners, and of course, above all, someplace that is near access to the grid. Now, when communities look at development, what are they looking for? They're looking in order to designate urban and industrial expansion areas that are protected for that form of development. They look at prime soils, particularly in rural areas. They look at prime soils as a natural resource, something that has inherent value in and of itself. Just like we would look at a lake or a forest as a natural resource, soils have a natural resource value as well. Agricultural land is that it needs to be available in order to support their economic base. They also usually identify locally important natural resources, whether that be water bodies that are important to them, habitat areas, or culturally significant areas, especially when we start looking at things like tribal nations. They usually prioritize community character. They say, we moved here for a reason because we like it the way it is. That's community character. And then, of course, they almost always will prioritize, at least in the rural areas in the state, property rights and property values. This is an important thing for people to have control on the property and to maintain their property value. So those are the kinds of things that communities are looking for as compared to what developers are looking for. And somehow we need to try to marry these two things. And so we look to where can we find low impact siting examples, where we would actually put solar. This is the siting question. Where would we put it that it's going to have low impact on the community? And here's some examples that we've seen developed by a number of different organizations and things that tools that GPI either helped develop or have used. Integration with agricultural base and developing marginal farmland soils. This is something that the American Farmland Trust, which is the main national organization that is an advocate for agricultural protection, has developed what they call their smart solar siting principles. They recognize that solar is needed in order to decarbonize our energy system, but they say we need to be smart about where we put it in terms of kind of preserving our agricultural base and our prime soils. And so they have a series of conditions recommending on how to do that in their smart solar siting principles. Avoiding habitat and biodiversity areas. This is something that the Nature Conservancy, TNC, has done at great length and done a lot of study on, and they have a whole guidance around that called Site Renewables Right. And it identifies where solar and wind have impacts on biodiversity and habitat, and how we can actually, by siting correctly, we can avoid those areas. They ran an analysis, a national analysis, that said, if we avoid those areas, do we still have enough land yet to develop enough solar and wind to decarbonize our energy system? And the answer is yes, we do. So we can do this. But we need to kind of pay attention to the principles of what we're trying to do. Prioritizing marginal lands, brownfields, abandoned mine lands, things like that. Several different projects that are working on that. Repower in America is an EPA-based work that's been doing this. TICTAC is the Thriving Communities Technical Assistance Center, which is an EPA program and this is where GPI is doing some work. We're actually helping communities identify where some of these marginal lands are and to help them remove the barriers to development on those areas. We're not going to be able to develop enough solar on brownfields and abandoned mine lands in order to meet our energy needs, but we should be doing it in a priority way because that feeds the community's interest. They're much more supportive of solar in those areas. And if we do that, then we have a better way to say, now we also need to do some development on some of the greenfield sites or agricultural sites. You're looking at things like productive use of buffer areas around industrial uses or wastewater treatment plants. This is something that is usually a little bit smaller in scale, but is very important. We've seen a couple of examples of that in a number of places here in Minnesota. There's, of course, a very large, about a 45 megawatt solar development going up actually around the Flint Hill Resources site down in Rosemont. Land that they had held as a buffer in kind of agriculture to keep people away from their facility there that is conventional refining and has a lot of emissions and pollution. And now they're going to do solar around it as a buffer, which is very creative. Similarly, we have the Met Council actually did around some of their wastewater treatment plants. They built solar facilities that are both helping power the actual treatment plant, but also being put out on the grid as a community solar garden project for cities to use. And then finally, we have understanding how to site things so that we're protecting surface and groundwater resources. And we have several projects that GPI is running that are specifically doing this. Repurposing irrigated agricultural lands, placing solar on wellhead protection areas, those kinds of choices, looking at where we have contaminated watersheds because of agricultural pollution and putting solar there instead as a buffer. We have lots and lots of land that we can use in order to do that, and it has direct benefit to the community. Okay, so that's the siting question. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the site design. How do we practice site design for co-benefits? And that's all about once we've picked where it goes, we pick how it's going to be built. And this is where we work with the developers as well as with the state regulators typically, and sometimes with local regulators, of moving from what we call a compliance mindset, which is here's a minimum standard that you need to meet, to instead adopt a co-benefits mindset, which is don't worry about the minimum standard, worry about the maximum amount of co-benefits that you can achieve in your development by designing it in order to achieve what the community would like to see in the development. And one of the things that we talk about frequently is that most large-scale solar projects, rather than being a sea of solar panels, is more than 50% open space. Just the land between the arrays and then in some of the buffer areas around the project area that need to be kept in place. There's over 50% of the project site is open space. And the only reason that that space is there is either to buffer it from an adjacent land use or to keep the panels from shading each other. So the question becomes, what do we do with that open space? How can we create co-benefits in that open space? What kind of design provisions do we need to go through in order to make sure that rather than just being a sea of solar panels, we actually have something that's contributing to the priorities of the community? So here's just a few examples. Agricultural opportunities. How should this be built? There's a lot of different ways we can address that question about how solar is impacting agriculture. Some of this is just simple recognition that if we cite these appropriately, we can actually enable multiple agricultural producers to receive a diversified income stream and become more economically viable. And we've heard this in many times from agricultural producers who actually allow solar to take up some of their land, that they have an income stream that is not dependent on crop commodity markets. It's dependent. It's a long-term, 25-year contract that they get a fixed amount every year or some amount in association sometimes with the amount of production. Obviously, we have co-located ag production on the site, such as the dual-use agrivoltaics that is kind of shown in the picture here. We have opportunities to do this. You're not going to generally do conventional agriculture like corn and soybeans on a solar farm. There's a few people experimenting with it. It can be done mechanically, but it's usually not a cost-effective means to proceed. And most of the research that's going into can we do things like conventional agriculture on a solar farm are saying it's a little problematic. And it's unlikely that we're going to be able to kind of make economic sense. However, there are other ways to co-locate agricultural production that actually does create benefit and can be done in a way that makes some sense, such as local food production, such as grazing. Grazing is the agrivoltaics strategy that has shown itself to be cost effective in the marketplace. Grazing as an agricultural agrivoltaics strategy, however, is limited by the market for sheep and lamb products. we don't have a huge sheep industry in Minnesota. We could expand it and it would diversify agriculture and it probably would be a good thing to do that. But we're never going to have a sheep industry that's going to be dominant in a way that's going to allow for agrivoltaics on a large number of the solar farms. We're always going to be looking at a proportion, at a percentage, of the solar farms that are going to be able to use grazing. So we have to find other ways to also do agrivoltaics, and local food production is something that I'll talk about in a minute, that helps a lot. And doing those agrivoltaics actually helps a lot with that protection and preservation of rural character, the kind of element of loss of agricultural land that affects the character of the community, is something that we can get to by incorporating agriculture into the actual design of the project. How do we practice co-benefits for things like protecting local water supplies? We've done, GPI has done a lot of work on this. The PV Smart example that's noted there in the link is a demonstration, a national study that we did, where we looked at and measured the actual hydrologic flows on solar farms that had been built, to see how stormwater, rainwater, affects the ground and how it runs off. The primary pollutant of our waters, in our country, is from non-point source pollution, which is stormwater runoff, either in an urban area or agricultural area. And we have excessive amounts of in urban areas. For instance, we have lots of impervious surface. The rain can't soak into the water. It runs, over parking lots and streets, carries pollutants with it, carries soil and sediment with it, pollutes our waters. And there's lots of regulation around that. We see the same dynamic happening in agricultural areas. Lots of rain carrying soil in, and the perception was that solar was contributing to that, or even making it worse, because solar panels are impervious. You pour water on them, it runs off, it doesn't go through. So their perception was that solar panels were actually making our watersheds and our surface waters worse. And what we documented is, in fact, that if you build it right, you're actually making it better. That actually our lakes and rivers and streams that we love so much in Minnesota, that if we site and design solar arrays and solar farms, appropriately, we are actually creating water quality benefit. We're reducing the amount of sediment, of phosphorus, of nitrates that are going into the groundwater, because we're able to use ground covers both underneath the panels and between the panels that will infiltrate the water into the soils and restore hydrologic flows, as well as preventing runoff that you see, and that you typically see in agricultural fields. So a lot of the water quality problems we have in the United States in rural areas is because of agricultural runoff. This is actually something where agriculture and solar can work in conjunction together in terms of improving, through good site design, our benefits to the communities. Habitat value. Most of the people here have heard about pollinator-friendly solar. That's what this is all about. But it's not just pollinators. There's other kinds of habitat that can be enhanced and can benefit from solar if we design it right. It does take extra care, both in terms of the design of the system as well as the maintenance of it over time, in order to maintain the habitat that we want to see and the benefit that communities can get directly out of this. We can support pollinators, small mammals, birds, reptiles, depending on what is local and indigenous and valuable to the community. And Minnesota has actually been a leader in this across the nation. We had the first pollinator-friendly standard, or habitat-friendly standard for solar established in Minnesota, and our state regulators have been very good about kind of making sure that we're taking into consideration both habitat and water quality benefits in solar farms that are being built in the state, and there's as well as a community solar that's being built. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the GPI specific things that we are currently doing that are helping with co-benefits. We have a new project that we're underway, called PV Success, and it is about ecosystem services. How can we develop and deploy an ecosystem decision tool for large community scale solar that is going to enhance decision making and create more community benefits for the host community. And we're looking at this in a number of different ways. We are going to be doing actual field research and science with the University of Minnesota to fill gaps in the scientific record on the relationship between solar development and ecosystem services, habitat, soil health, groundwater supplies, et cetera. We want to engage people who would potentially be using this framework, which would include solar developers, local governments, tribal governments, other kinds of advocates, to help them tell us what they need out of the research and out of the ultimate tools that we'll be developing. We want to make sure that we're examining the ecosystem priorities across different kinds of communities. We have specific recognition that a local host community will look at its ecosystem priorities one way. A state agency will look at ecosystem priorities in a different way, and a tribal nation will look at ecosystem priorities in even a different way. And so we have three specific use cases that we're working with in terms of developing what the priorities are and how do we create tools that are going to help with making good ecosystem decisions. And then finally, we're recognizing what is called the critical role of what is called cultural services. Because when we think of ecosystem service, we tend to think of things like habitat and watersheds and soil health. But in fact, ecosystem services also have cultural ramifications. And that would be things like viewshed and community character. It would be things like perceptions about your economic base. It would be things like spiritual relationships that some of the tribal nations look at in terms of the kind of the way the ecosystems work in their nations. And those are called cultural services. And frequently, those are the biggest barriers to solar. And so we're kind of doing a direct look at those. And we have three different kind of use cases we're looking at. We have a overall technical committee that's overseeing it. And then we have a host community committee. We have a tribal nation committee, and we have a state agency committee that are helping guide the research and the deployment and dissemination of our research results. We also have another project that's just getting ready to start called and nobody knows what this means, but I love saying it, the DWISMA Solar Project. What is a DWISMA? DWISMA is the term that the Minnesota Department of Health uses to describe a wellhead protection area for drinking water supplies. It stands for Drinking Water Supply Management Areas. Drinking Water Management Supply Areas, DWISMAs. And the DWISMA Solar Project is looking at wellhead protection areas, which are, the recharge areas for our rural water supplies and sometimes our suburban water supplies and groundwater. And we're going to try and use those areas in order to do solar development. And the reason we wanted to use those areas for solar development is because they're currently in agriculture. And agriculture is a direct vector for nitrate contamination. We have a nitrate problem in our drinking water supplies in Minnesota, as well as in much of the Midwest and even other parts of the nation. And the DWISMA Solar Project is going to be helping 4 communities in Southwest Minnesota develop deployment-focused clean energy plans that are specific to their community and addressing their priorities. And the plan is to deploy solar on the wellhead protection area. We want to proactively bring those projects and make sure that those co-benefits are flowing to rural communities, and then demonstrate how this can be done statewide in terms of large-scale solar. And you might say, come on, how much land can this be, right? Wellhead protection area. Right now, there are in Minnesota about 1.4 million acres of land in the WISMAs, in wellhead protection areas. And of that land, there's probably about 300,000 acres of it that are in agriculture. And these are places that the Department of Ag would actually kind of rather see not an ag, right? The Department of Ag is very protective of agricultural lands. Well, this is a place where it's maybe better for them not to be. And the Department of Health has actually been working to try to take those lands out of agriculture for a long time, but they can only do so 40 acres at a time. It's like, buy a parcel of land when you find a willing landowner, put a conservation easement on it and pay somebody some money. Well, and we said, how can we actually do this in order to um, work instead of 40 acres at a time, let's work at 500 acres at a time by doing solar. Um, so these plans that we're going to be doing are going to look at how the solar can not only be built, but also be actually deployed in the community by producing affordable and resilient energy for the water utilities themselves. We want to help local landowners convert these areas in order to reduce nitrate contamination. And that's very attractive to the landowner because, of course, solar as a land use pays 2 to 3 times what that same landowners can get from that land in agricultural use. And then finally, we want to help communities create community benefit agreements so that we can proactively know what they want to see when large scale solar comes to their communities, so they will accept it and we will build social license. I also want to just mention quickly in the last few minutes, um, another program that we're running called Soul Smart, which has been around for 5 years, or actually more like 7 years. We've been doing this work. It is a designation program for solar-ready communities. And it started as a program that was focusing just on rooftop solar, but it has now expanded and includes work that's being done where communities have authority over large-scale solar as well. And so we're helping a lot of communities. There's over 600 communities in the nation that have been designated as solar ready. And I will say that Minnesota, state of Minnesota, has the second largest number of designated communities as any other state in the nation. Illinois is first, Minnesota second. Um, and this is something that's free technical assistance for communities to help them address solar and become solar ready, as we say, but really help them understand how solar can be deployed from the rooftop to the solar farm in their community in a way that's consistent with their own priorities. And then the final example I wanted to put up, and this is just kind of a fun one, it's a small project, but we're currently working on some agrivoltaics partnerships. And I alluded to this earlier, is really kind of saying how we can do local food production on solar sites. And many of you are familiar with the site out at Big Lake that US Solar owns, where they are actually doing farming between the arrays, and they're bringing in immigrant farmers who would not have otherwise have access to land to do farming on, to do small scale vegetable production on the solar farm itself. So that land, that open space between the arrays, they're actually using it to farm. And importantly, this is a critically important thing, it's a conventionally designed solar farm. It's not something where we've elevated the panels up 6 feet in the air and increased the cost of the solar installations where it's less economically viable. This is a conventionally designed solar farm that is competing in the marketplace. In this case, it is a community solar project, but where we are actually creating both local food benefit and building access to land for farmers who are mostly BIPOC farmers and immigrant farmers to have access to land that they wouldn't able to otherwise to have. And we're working with Big River Farms, which is a nonprofit organization, and the Food Group, which is really working to help support sustainable and regenerative farming designs and better integration of farming with ecosystems. Uh, you know, and having that organization vet the farmers and train them on how to do farming in solar farms is a critical piece of this initiative. And we're really looking to hopefully to expand this, roll it out in more places, particularly since it's designed on a conventional system. So I've been talking for an hour, so now I have to stop.
Oh, Brian, that's awesome. That's awesome. Uh, one thing I wanted to mention to you, when you talked about Illinois, I was just talking to some people actually in New York, and they're involved in that solar suitcase program. And they were telling me that some of the developers in Illinois are buying a lot of solar suitcases and then giving those to the communities, to the schools, the libraries, and everything, just to build that connection with the community. And it sounds like it's becoming quite successful. And I just thought, boy, there's a, like one solar kind of thing helping another one develop. So that was interesting. But anyway,
Yeah, Doug, I have no idea what a solar suitcase is. I'm out of the loop, apparently. I
oh,
may have to look it up.
it's just it's about the size of a piece of luggage, and kids put it together in their schools and learn about electricity and solar. And some of them they take apart and use them the next time. Some of them they take and ship to Africa and light up schools that have no electricity over there. And so
Okay.
it's really a cool program. We've got over 100 schools in Minnesota involved in it. And this program that they're doing is in about 11 states right now. And it's been going on for years. It started at PG&E. And then, of all things, the second popular one was New Jersey. I mean, who would have thought New Jersey would be interested in that? But they're quite active, I guess. So anyway, what other questions do we have? You want to put up your hands, please, and we'll call on you? Or did he do such a good job we have nothing left to answer?
Well,
John,
what
John, go ahead.
I used up all the time. That's probably the problem.
No,
Uh, can you hear me?
yeah, go ahead.
Okay. Um, I, I'm thinking about the power of Minnesota and the wind. It was a program made about 10 years ago, and it shows the power and benefit of wind for local communities and urban communities. But one thing I've heard is that um, a lot of rural communities and particularly the farmers can't access the power that they're producing on their land because they're part of co-ops that have signed long-term contracts that are based on coal and natural gas, and they can't get out of those contracts. So that again is the idea that um, their energy that they're producing on their land is going to urban areas, but they're also not able to access it because they're serving the interests of large utility providers. So is that a problem, or how do you deal with that?
Well, it is a problem, and it does depend on which particular generation and transmission co-op you're referring to. There are a few that have what they call 100% all requirements contracts, where they indeed the local co-op has no option to self-generate. I mean, individual homeowners and businesses they they're not prevented from self-generating, but the co-op cannot become the vehicle by which that happens. And that is a problem, and it's something that is kind of in the process, probably in the process of being addressed, but it's going to take a long time probably because there are a lot of very economic interests that are protective of those arrangements. So it is something that has been a problem. I believe some of the great co-ops, however, do allow some level of self-generation by the co-op, 5 or 10 or 20%
Yep.
um, of their load. So it's not across the board. Um, and there are new models that are being developed, but I think we're going to be a while before we actually see them in place. So you're absolutely right. This is a problem in terms of kind of development of local resources for local needs.
There are some co-ops that have actually left the just generation group in order to allow themselves to put in more solar. And one of the biggest co-ops in Minnesota has done that. So it's a good point, John. Mark, question?
Yeah, Brian, have they ever done a study on if they were to put solar on all the big box stores in the metro area and how much power would be generated?
Not specifically that one end use, but there has been a lot of work, and in fact, we've done a lot of work on this as well, to evaluate what the total uh, opportunity is for rooftop solar as it compares to local energy use. We did a whole series of analyses for a number of different kinds of cities where we looked at we use the Minnesota Solar, solar app map, to identify where how much solar resource we had on rooftops within a given city. And we said, okay, if we developed all of the economic resource, if we put every single roof that had an economic resource, if we put a solar panel on it, or solar array on it, how much generation would occur and how does that compare to the actual energy use in that community? And what we discovered was that what we call this the rooftop solar reserve, right, within a community. If you think about it like an oil reserve, it's the rooftop solar reserve, and that it was sufficient in kind of dense central city kind of communities and first year suburbs to meet somewhere around 25 to 35% of their total electric energy needs. And in more suburban communities and in exurban communities, it could go up to 70 or even 100% in those communities. However, we also did some analysis looking at just what were in a given community, if you looked at the 10 best opportunities for rooftop solar, which is usually going to be things like big box stores, how much of their energy could be met by doing just those facilities. So we actually did do that analysis in probably a dozen communities or in Minnesota. And what we discovered is it was usually somewhere around, well, I guess it actually varied a lot because in the city of Minneapolis, of course, the top 10 is barely going to be a dent. But in most smaller communities, it was going to be somewhere around 2 to 5% of the electric energy needs of that community could be met with solar on the big box stores or on the similar size roofs. So it's an important element, and it's actually a lot more than people probably think it is when they think about how much solar can we generate in our community. But it kind of also demonstrates that if we're going to meet our solar energy goals and our clean energy goals, we can't just do it with rooftop solar. We need to have other options.
Okay.
And
I just want to share with you quickly. There's a project that I just heard about this week. It's called the Lighthouse Project in New Orleans. And what they've done is they're working with churches in New Orleans. They have 18 on board now. They're shooting for 86. And what they're doing is they're putting solar on the churches and also batteries. So when storms hit and things like that happen, there's a place for people to go to that'll have electricity, and they'll also have communications. So that to me, that was just amazing, and maybe that's something maybe we should think about around here. Anyway, Louis, go ahead, jump in. Chris, I'm going to call you next.
First of all, Brian, that was absolutely magnificent work you're all doing. I'm extremely impressed, beyond impressed, really. My question is, you showed early on a slide with 2,600 gigawatts of new energy, renewable energy, and you said that there's like half that amount. Is it in the whole United States of renewable energy?
Not a renewable of any form of energy.
Any form. So
right, any form of electric generation.
I see. And so how many of these projects will continue on, will actually be produced if there's that much more?
Yeah, well, it's a good question. When you look at the stuff that's in the queue, that 26 gigawatts, 2,600 gigawatts of solar, or of capacity. At any given point in time, only about 14% of those projects will actually ever get built.
Oh,
And that's because of things like interconnection barriers, of other forms of barriers that the developers get to a point where they just say, okay, I'm done. I'm not going to try and do it. It used to be much higher, but right now, because of a lot of transmission constraints, we're unable to build because in order to interconnect to the grid, it gets so expensive that the project doesn't pencil anymore. But the point we're looking at is that those are all real projects, and all of those people think that they have an off-taker. So there's that much capacity. And I will say that obviously we're measuring this capacity in megawatts of rated capacity. The amount of energy produced by a solar farm that that's 100 megawatts is dramatically lower than the amount of energy being produced by a gas-fired power plant of 100 megawatts. So it's not exactly a one-to-one comparison, but we kind of measure it in megawatts, and it's a demonstration of actually how much there is out there that could be built if we were to remove the barriers to that construction.
thank you very much. That's great. Thank you.
Hey, Chris, go ahead, please.
Well, I have a few questions, and I can kind of hit them one by one, or just skip some of these. But what's the plan for preventing compaction, soil compaction, in the development of PV farms?
That's a great question, and that's when we did the our PV Smart project. Compaction of soils was the issue to address when you're doing construction and maintenance of a solar farm in order to prevent runoff and increase infiltration. There's a number of different techniques that are actually not that difficult to do, and that many solar developers have already adopted them. When you, as an example, minimizing the amount of grading that you're doing. I mean, if what you do is actually install the solar farm on the topography of the land without grading it, there's dramatic reductions in the amount of compaction that occurs in the construction process. And staging your development so that you're running the heavy equipment in one place rather than everywhere also helps with compaction. And then finally, even at the end of the construction phase, you can decompact the soils in a variety of different ways. And then if you're planting a good ground cover, which ideally you should actually do before you start the installation process, the root systems themselves help prevent the compaction and decompact the soils over time if those root systems and that vegetation is maintained over time. So one of the things that we advocate for in our best practices is that the compaction of soils, the bulk density of the soil, actually be measured before the project, during the project, and after the project, in order to make sure that we're maintaining that site as an infiltration area rather than an area that's going to be creating runoff.
I remember when I worked at the Science Museum, there was a fellow from the soils department at the University of Minnesota that demonstrated lysimeters. Is a lysimeter a way that you are trying to, measure for farmers? Because when farmers saw how much runoff there was before and then after decompaction, it made a huge difference in their attitude.
Yeah, actually, a lysimeter is a device that measures the amount of nitrate movement through the soil rather than the infiltration of the compaction. There's a couple other devices that we use to measure compaction or bulk density. Lysimeters are an important tool because it does measure, kind of how much nitrate is getting into the soil. We're currently doing some work with with lysimeters on our current PV Success project, where we've kind of identified that on a solar farm, the amount of nitrates in the soil itself is, and I'm going to get my units wrong, but it is probably about a third of what you would see in the ideal amount of nitrates in the soil for corn production. So if you wanted to produce corn, you want to see 20, and what we're seeing on a solar farm is something more around 6. And of course, if you're over applying nitrates on your cornfields, it's even going to be higher. So
Okay.
lysimeters measure that, and that's actually an important part of our groundwater assessment that we're doing.
Great. Okay, I'm gonna ask three more things in a row, and then you can just tackle them all or none. One is that a PV developer, a few years back told me of his concern of the actual zinc coating and other pollutants in making racking that actually polluted the soil. I wanted to know if that toxicity is real or if he's not talking right. The other is there are political barriers in Illinois I'm aware of. My mom lives near one of the farms that they're really having trouble getting it in. There are political instigators against solar in the community, or actually go to communities to kind of ditch these projects. And I was wondering if you identify those instigators. And then how can we help?
Okay, well, I mean, on the first one, are the components of the solar farm in terms of the racking system or the panels actually contributing to soil contamination? You know, we could probably do more measurement of this to kind of have a scientific answer. But right now, we do have some anecdotal work and some science that's been done on it, and the quick answer is no. There is no amount of really measurable contamination coming from the equipment itself in terms of kind of going down and residing in the soil, unless there's something wrong. If the racking system is actually broken, or it was poorly manufactured, it is rusting and decaying, or that something happened to a panel and it hasn't been fixed. But we have no incidents of soil contamination that we can point to in all of the solar farms around that came from the equipment on the land itself.
Okay, while you're saying that, let me just butt in for a second because you can build on this. And this is what I heard from a certain table at the state fair, where they were using this pollutant thing as a deterrent for people they were speaking to, as well as the way these racking systems are being installed now with long, deep posts, because saying, no, they say when you retire a PV array, you got great soil, you come back to the farm again, but no, it's polluted and you can't dig these things out, it's hard to dig these things out of the ground, the stabilizers.
Yeah, that is not true.
Yes.
The simple answer is no. When you decommission a solar farm, you can get those things out. In fact,
Okay.
it's much easier to decommission, much easier to return a solar farm to agriculture than almost any other kind of development you can imagine.
Okay.
So that's the quick answer there. I mean, the bigger problem is usually cables that are buried underneath. Sometimes that could be an issue, but usually they're buried deep enough that if you're going to turn it back into agriculture, it's not an issue. So, but yeah, the racking systems come completely out. And then the second question is, if the soils are contaminated, absolutely not. What we typically see is soil health is actually improving, and that's one of the things that we're actually documenting now in the studies that we're doing.
Yeah, Flint Hills is using nitrogen generating plants under theirs. So, okay, one final question from Steve Coleman.
Hello, Doug. As always, thank you for having set this up. And I have one comment and one question about soil compaction from some experience on solar sites. A contributing factor to soil compaction is the use of material handling equipment with semi-pneumatic or very hard, narrow tires. And that can be mitigated by larger flotation tires or tracked equipment. Think of what a farmer uses when farming. They don't use the narrow, hard wheels and tires, and that's one way of doing it. Um, but a question about co-benefits and what the community wants. Um, I recall one example of and have you experienced in this or any thoughts on it? Um, an exurban um, rural interface where landowners were motivated to put a property into a solar farm to prevent dense housing development that they feared zoning changes could easily create, that would change the nature of their open space around their property. So wondered if that has come up in any way. Thank you all very much.
Yeah, well, thanks, Steve. He passed me a softball. The 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 whole idea of using solar as kind of an urban growth strategy, an urban barrier, is one that I've been working on for years, and I can't get anybody to buy. And maybe it sounds like you have an example, Steve, and I should probably find out what that is. Um, because we have a lot of people who are concerned about maintaining rural character. And the biggest threat to rural character is, of course, not solar, but subdivisions, and additional housing. It's also the biggest risk to the loss of farmland. We have far more land that's going to be lost to housing development or other kinds of development than to solar development in any given year. Just that the solar development usually happens in a bigger, one-time chunks. But kind of thinking about using solar as a means to stop the growth of housing out of a city in order to preserve the rural character on the other side of that is actually a very viable strategy, because nobody's going to build a sewer system through the solar farm in order to serve the houses on the other side. And so it is actually something that kind of it can be used as a growth management strategy, and something that I've been trying to get some of the planners, my fellow planners, to acknowledge and recognize and put in their toolbox, but haven't had too much success with it yet.
Well, Brian, thank you so very much. John, we're going to have to skip you this time. We're right up against our board meeting. And Brian, 10,000 thank yous. This was great, really good information, and like a whole nother perspective, of talking about solar and some of the issues involved. So thank you so much. I can't wait to get this up on videotape and use it to share with people. So thank you. And like they say, until better paid. Okay.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good to see you guys.
Take care. Board members will switch over to Mr. Weber's system right now. Take care.